This video may contain nuts. Well, at least one nut. This is a car I've been wanting to do for quite a while. When I visited India in 2006, my enduring memory was Maruti Suzuki cars were everywhere. This was in stark contrast to the first time I'd been to India in 1993, where all that seemed to be around were ambassadors and Padminis, ancient vehicles from the 50s and 60s. In just 13 years, Suzuki seemed to have conquered India without any other car company getting a look in, and Suzuki still ruled the roost. In 2022, they owned 42% of the Indian car market. Any other car company would kill for that amount of market share in such a large country. The car that started it all was the Maruti Suzuki 800, the little car that could. From its launch in 1983 to the end of production 30 years later, it's witnessed a resurgent India, and it's helped to make that happen. So just why did India fall in love with Suzuki, a car company that's failed to conquer other markets? And why was the 800 so popular? This is the story of India's people's car, the Maruti Suzuki 800. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister of a newly independent India in 1947. His family would come to dominate Indian politics in the decades that followed. His daughter Indira Gandhi, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, became Prime Minister in 1966, and her son Rajiv Gandhi would become Prime Minister in the 1980s. So Indira Gandhi's other son, Sanjay, had a lot of connections, and he was expected to succeed his mother as Prime Minister. His passion, though, was cars, and he apprenticed at Rolls-Royce in the 1960s. When his mother's government proposed producing a locally made car for India's middle class in 1971, it was perhaps inevitable that Sanjay became head of this new company, Maruti Motors Limited. There were, of course, calls of nepotism. Sanjay had no previous experience running a company, yet at a time when getting a license to produce cars in India was almost impossible, Maruti was allowed to produce 50,000 cars per year. Maruti designed their people's car using a Triumph motorcycle engine. It was supposed to be affordable, but the retail price quickly doubled. Despite boasts that this would soon be India's mass-produced car, only 21 were ever made. In 1977, Indira Gandhi's government was out, and the new administration called a halt to Maruti's misadventures. But 3 years later, Gandhi was back in power, and despite her son Sanjay dying in a plane crash, the idea of an Indian people's car was back on the agenda. After all, there was a real need for a practical, inexpensive car to get India's people and the economy moving. There were cars being produced in India, but both were hopelessly out of date and expensive to produce. The premier Padmini was essentially an early 1960s Fiat 1200, and the Hindustan Ambassador was a 1950s Morris Oxford. India needed a car that was efficient, cheap to produce, and reliable. But this wasn't a green light for Maruti to continue doing what it had been doing, which wasn't a lot. There had been a massive outcry in the 1970s that the whole Maruti affair had cost a lot of money without producing anything of value. Clearly this company couldn't produce a car by itself. A foreign partner was needed. There were discussions with Volkswagen to produce the Golf and the Jetta, but that led nowhere. Fiat weren't interested after their previous deal with Premier Automobiles. Peugeot and Renault were interested, and Maruti started discussions with Renault. Both companies agreed the Renault 18 would be a car of interest, but then the Indian delegation visited the Japanese auto show and realised that actually a car that was bigger than the Hindustan Ambassador wasn't the right thing for an Indian people's car. America's people's car was the Ford Model T, a cheap car that everyone could own. Germany's people's car was a Beetle, a cheap car that everyone could own. Britain's people's car was the Mini. In France it was the 2CV. In Italy it was the Fiat 500. You get the point. Maybe the right car was one of those tiny little K cars that were zipping around Japan. Maruti talked with Toyota and Mitsubishi, but started serious talks with Daihatsu. But then another opportunity came from out of the blue. A director for Suzuki Motors was in India to talk motorcycles when he happened to read about Maruti's search for a partner. An inquiry soon led to a full-blown deal. Suzuki had launched the Alto a few years earlier and this car seemed perfect. It was a cost-effective, modern, practical front-wheel drive hatchback that could seat 5. The new joint venture would be known as Maruti Suzuki, with Suzuki initially taking a 25% share. The agreement had been signed in 1982 and the following year cars were already rolling off the Maruti factory production line. But not many of them were rolling off the production line to start with, so to satisfy anticipated demand, the Indian government allowed cars to be imported from Japan. This understandably annoyed the existing Indian car makers who weren't allowed to do this sort of thing. You can see the existing car makers were getting frustrated. Maruti were being given an unfair advantage from a government that had shown favouritism to Maruti since the Prime Minister's son had created the company. Now Maruti had a very real chance of dwarfing these existing companies with a new modern vehicle and an influx of Japanese cash. This favouritism wasn't going to last though. Japanese imports could only happen for 2 years. While the Maruti factory initially only assembled imported Japanese parts, the ultimate goal was for more and more of the car to be produced locally. All this rush was so Maruti could help kickstart an Indian economy that had for too long stagnated while other economies took off. India needed affordable cars to thrive, and it needed them now. On December the 14th, 1983, on what would have been Sanjay Gandhi's birthday, the first Maruti Suzuki 800 was presented with great fanfare to its owner by Indira Gandhi. The 800 might be small, but it was thoroughly modern. The tiny 800cc engine that gave the car its name was smaller than those in the Hindustan Ambassador and the Premier Padmini, but it was much more fuel efficient, and with the 800 being lighter, it was faster as well. Maruti's Super Mini introduced other novelties like synchromesh and disc brakes, something that had been in the West for a long time. But the most important thing the 800 brought to India was reliability, something important for India's bumpy roads and a game changer after the Ambassador and the Padmini. In the rare event it did go wrong, it was cheaper and easier to maintain. This was a new age for India. Maruti Suzuki expected production of 20,000 cars in the first year and 40,000 the year after. Demand for this modern car was far greater though, with over 120,000 orders. Some families had to wait 3 years to get a car, and it meant a black market opened up with people paying double the sticker price just to get their hands on one. Demand was so high that Maruti Suzuki had to curtail production of their second vehicle, the Maruti Suzuki van, which was a rebadged Suzuki Carry that arrived in 1984. A year later, the company introduced the Gypsy King off-roader. That year, Maruti produced their 100,000th vehicle. On overcrowded Indian roads where the tiny tuk-tuk ruled, the diminutive 800 was ideal. It was soon India's best-selling car. In 1984, Suzuki updated the Japanese version of the car, so in 1986 the 800 got parts from that car, including the body. On the old model, only the glass lifted up at the back, but the new car got a practical full tailgate. There was a new dashboard, but maybe the most important item was optional air conditioning, a welcome addition in a hot, humid country. The 800 also had 5 doors. In fact, from day one it had 5 doors. Despite India wanting bargain basement price cars, one thing that they were unwilling to compromise on was rear doors, something surprising for those of us in Europe in the 1980s. We were happy to drop the rear doors if we could get the car cheaper or get a few more features. But not India, it was rear doors or nothing. In the early 2000s, Maruti produced too many 3-door cars for export and had to try to sell them in India. They tried to pass them off as 3-door coupes, but India was having none of it. With the car riding high, Maruti Suzuki started exports to Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. They skipped Pakistan, firstly because of the tension between the two countries, but also because Suzuki had done a separate deal to produce the Alto there as well. By 1988, the Maruti Suzuki factory was churning out 100,000 cars per year, and by 1991, 65% of its parts were being produced locally. Exports expanded to Western Europe despite protests from Suzuki. In countries where Suzuki had quotas, the cars only used the Maruti brand, and every reference to Suzuki was expunged from the car. Selling into countries such as France and Italy meant advanced safety equipment like safety belts had to be included. It wasn't yet a thing in India. Soon those Western European countries also required catalytic converters, sapping performance and fuel economy from the tiny engine. That left the car less competitive on performance, but the looks also needed an update, something Suzuki had done on the Alto in 1988 and would again in 1994. Suzuki in Japan understood the update cycle of cars and pushed for the 800 to be replaced by the Suzuki Servo, a car very similar to the latest Alto. After all, it was more modern, but they also had an ulterior motive. The 10-year production license for the 800 in India was about to expire. After 1993, Suzuki would make nothing from 800 sales. Of course, that was just fine with Maruti. The company might now be 50% owned by Suzuki, but it had to focus on its best interests. But then, was it really in its best interest? This was the path that Hindustan Motors and Premier Automobiles had followed, keep producing the same old car. Both of these companies were now headed for bankruptcy as they became increasingly irrelevant. Maruti didn't know how to design their own cars and were completely reliant on Suzuki for new vehicles, so annoying them for a bit of extra cash wasn't maybe the best thing to do. No, a modern India needed modern cars, and Maruti Suzuki needed to produce those modern cars to stay in business. So a compromise was struck. The 800 would continue on sale next to the larger Suzuki Servo, branded as the Maruti Zen, and Suzuki would get a small royalty for every 800 sold. In turn, Suzuki agreed to make small updates to the 800 to keep it relevant. The first change was a new grille in 1994, but a more major update appeared in 1997 with new headlamps, wraparound bumpers, a new dashboard and the steering wheel from the Zen. It also got intermittent wipers for the first time. But this was still a basic car. The highest trim level got tinted glass, body side mouldings, a sun visor vanity mirror, split rear seats, upholstery on the doors and seats, and all-important air conditioning. The 800 got spicier in 2000 with a more powerful 800cc engine that had 4 valves per cylinder instead of 2, fuel injection and a 5-speed gearbox. This was all to help the car meet Euro 2 emission rules, but the 46 horsepower engine turned the 800 into what for India was a hot hatch. The fact that their hot hatch got to 60 in 18.5 seconds showed just how pedestrian the rest of India's cars were. After all, the regular 800 got to 60 in 28 seconds. The Suzuki Alto lineage is a little confusing, especially when you cross-reference it with what Maruti were making. They were still selling the 800, which was essentially a 1980s Suzuki Alto. The Maruti Zen was a Suzuki Servo, a car similar but not quite the same as the 4th generation 1994 Alto that was a Japan exclusive. The rest of the world generally got the Servo. Suzuki then updated the Alto in 1998, and this car was meant to be a world car. They brought it to India as the Maruti Suzuki Alto in 2000, and it got the 800's fuel-injected engine. Despite the availability of the larger Zen and Alto, maybe due to its low price, the 800 remained India's most popular car. Maruti Suzuki, of course, would prefer that customers were choosing their more expensive models, so they encouraged buyers to trade up by dropping the fuel-injected engine from the 800 lineup. No more hot hatch. Maybe it was this that did the trick, or maybe Indians warmed to the new Alto. In any case, in 2004, the Alto overtook the 800 to become India's most popular car. By the 2000s, traffic was increasing on Indian roads, in no small part due to the 800's success. That brought more pollution, and some cities and states called for compliance with new Euro 3 emission rules. So, thanks to the Suzuki deal in the 90s, the 800's engine was updated to ensure it would keep selling. Another way to reduce emissions is with liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG. It was also cheaper and could lead to lower maintenance costs as it was kinder to the engine. there was a new LPG version of the 800 that was sold, the Duo that could run on both petrol and LPG. Maruti Suzuki by now was going from strength to strength. By 2006, they produced 5 million cars. And by the time they introduced the 800 Duo, Maruti Suzuki had a range of this many cars. The first 5 million had taken them 23 years. The next 5 million cars took just 6 years. Maruti and India were on a roll. Future cars, though, needed to meet Euro 4 emissions rules, and customers didn't seem to be going for an LPG version, so this meant another update to the 800's engine. Maruti had good reason to keep the 800 on the market. Tata Motors had launched their ultra-cheap wonder car, the Nano, that was set to sweep India. The only car that could remotely compete with it on price was Maruti's ancient but bargain basement 800. But the Nano failed terribly. It was seen as cheap and down market, and Indians would rather be seen in a second-hand Alto. With the threat of the low-cost Nano evaporating and certain Indian cities already banning the 800 with even tougher pollution rules, Maruti decided to phase out their long-running 5-door hatchback. The last Maruti Suzuki 800 rolled off the production line in January 2013 to great fanfare. 2.87 million of them had been produced, with 2.66 million of them being sold in India. Since then, Maruti have continued to thrive. By 2023, they produced a total of 25 million cars, and by 2025, they were producing over 500,000 cars a quarter. In 2023, the Japanese company Suzuki sold 3.4 million cars. Over 2 million of those cars, over half of them, were sold in India. It's safe to say that Maruti Suzuki is a very important part of the Suzuki family, and it was fortuitous for them that back in the early 80s, a Suzuki director happened to read about a possible tie-up. Indians, of course, have a soft spot for the 800. It's a car that almost everyone of that generation has some sort of connection to. The first owner was Harpal Singh, and it was his pride and joy. He refused to sell it, driving it until he passed away in 2010. That car is now rightly in a museum. It's really a symbol of India. After all, the country in 1983 was struggling under decades of slow growth. When production ended in 2013, India had changed drastically. It was on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse, and some of that is thanks to the little car that could, the Maruti Suzuki 800. The Tata Nano was supposed to sweep India, but as I mentioned, its story ended very badly. I've done a video on that car and also the Hindustan Ambassador, and there's links to both of them on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.